Okay, sharing my screen. Mm, In honor of Earth Day, I'd like to take this time to show gratitude for this planet and the amazing natural resources we've benefited from thus far, and to acknowledge the Tongva community who inhabited the land on which Watts sits long before it was developed. We have a lot of work to do to make Watts a better place for future generations, where they can enjoy a healthy environment free from pollutants and environmental contamination, and receive equitable health, economic, and social benefits due them. According to the California Environmental Protection Agency, Watts is among the top 5% most polluted and vulnerable communities in the state and has the lowest life expectancy of any other community in California. In addition to efforts to provide basic resources like fresh food and water and a contaminant-free environment, we should also be striving to preserve the history, culture, traditions, and built environment of communities. Historic preservation and the reuse of historic structures is the ultimate recycling strategy. The use and adaptive reuse of historic buildings and the installation of energy-saving design elements, for example, can be more climate friendly than new construction. When historic structures are torn down, we lose not only an irreplaceable resource, but also we lose the total amount of human and mechanical energy that originally went into its construction, its embodied energy. Tear downs also release toxins and other pollutants directly into the air, water, and soil, and they produce mass amounts of debris that go into the soil and landfills. The added benefit of using and adapting historic resources is that they help tell the full story of our neighborhoods, retaining a unique sense of place. If they're moved or altered, they lose aspects of significance and meaning. And every year we lose irreplaceable parts of our collective cultural heritage, sometimes before we even know they exist. The priorities we establish now will determine the effectiveness of our stewardship of the cultural resources in our own backyard for the good of generations to come after us. The following are some of the resources identified by Survey LA, which was a comprehensive program undertaken by the city of Los Angeles to identify historic resources in Los Angeles County that are eligible for local, state, and national nomination. Some are already landmarked. Others I feel deserve consideration as landmarks. They constitute a variety of historic resources, from churches, statues, murals, to schools, to cultural centers, and even natural resources. Interspersed among the slides of the historic resources will be a history of Watts for context. And it's important to note that the city of LA has about 1,200 recognized local landmarks, and under 5% of those are associated with people of color. One of the first designated monuments in Watts was the Watts train station. It's listed on the local, state, and national register. After landowner C.H. Watts died, his family donated 10 acres of their land to the Pacific Electric Railway to encourage development. The Watts train depot was built on the donated land in 1904. Watts has a history that extends beyond the 1965 and 92 rebellions. The first Watts Renaissance, beginning in 1918, is where arts began to flourish during the rise of Pan-Africanism led by Marcus Garvey and the New Negro movement, which is also, or better known as, the Harlem Renaissance. Watts was exempt from LA's midnight curfew on dance clubs, so folks made their way into Watts after dark, and often early into the morning. The entertainment venues that sprung up along Central Avenue flowed into the Watts area. There are places like the Plantation Club, the Watts Country Club, and Leaks Lake, which was just a simple dance hall built around a frog pond. At the lake, there's Jelly Roll Morton, who influenced the formation of modern jazz. He would teach musicians and then join them on stage to perform afterwards. Hollywood elites like Charlie Chaplin and Fatty Arbuckle were frequent patrons to the Plantation Club. Some of the figures who participated in the early music and art scene of the Watts Renaissance also grew up in Watts. Artists like Buddy Collette, Charles Mingus, and the Woodman brothers, Cecil Big J. McNeely, Don Cherry, and renowned Harlem Renaissance poet Arna Bontemps, and many more. Another historic resource that was built before Watts was annexed to Los Angeles was the Watts Fire Station, or Engine Company 65. It's eligible for listing in the local California and National Register of Historic Places. The original firehouse was either demoed or extended to accommodate the new police/fire station combo that was built in 1936. Engine Company 65 is eligible because it's one of the very few institutional buildings remaining in Watts from the pre-World War II period. It's also a notable example of a pre-war fire station that exhibits a high quality of design. Currently, it's being adaptively reused for Kaiser Permanente to occupy it for a couple of years. In the 1940s and 50s, the economic center of the community was 103rd Street, or formerly Main Street. It contained a few blocks of small businesses, various eateries, and 2 theaters, the Largo and the Jaeger, which was renamed the Linda at some point. Streets were populated by working class families. Pullman car porters and cooks joined German immigrants, Japanese farmers, and the Mexican-American rail workers who came to build the Pacific Electric Railway running through. Watts continued to produce artists like Anthony Robert, Tony Ortega, Etta James, and Ray Vasquez. The Black population in Watts was the highest by the 1950s at about 72%. Along with the high rate of homeownership, Watts was dominated by large housing projects, mostly built after the war to house war workers in the garden apartment style. This style came about for many reasons, one of which was the genius and humanity of a number of local architects, planners, and landscape architects in their investment in building a better city. Hacienda Village is eligible for local, state, and national register for its significance as one of the oldest public housing complexes in Los Angeles. It was built during the war, unlike the other housing projects in Watts. It was designed by a team of master architects, including Paul R. Williams, who was the lead architect, Richard Neutra, and William Beckett. Nickerson Gardens is an example. It's an eligible resource and was constructed at a higher density than pre-World War II public housing and with less open space. A more extensive survey is needed to determine which structures date the war era and to determine if they're even eligible for designation. Imperial Courts was another garden-style apartment. It was determined ineligible because it was constructed beginning in 1944 outside of the period of significance for public and defense housing. But because this theme for post-1945 public housing complexes hasn't yet been developed, I think the housing complex should be reevaluated when further research can be done. And Jordan Downs began redevelopment and demolition before an extensive survey of its significance could be conducted. Jordan High School was founded in 1923 as Watts High School before Watts was consolidated into the city of Los Angeles. It's on the California Register of Historic Places and eligible for the National Register. There are 5 contributing buildings on the campus, including the auditorium, that are eligible for individual listing on the National Register. The buildings are exemplary of the Public Works Administration, modern style. They're excellent examples of an LAUSD campus constructed after the 1933 Long Beach earthquake. Prominent Los Angeles architect Sumner P. Hunt was among the notable designers responsible for the remodeling and retrofitting effort of the building. Enhanced by the broader civil rights movement and the coming of age of the Black arts movement, along with discrimination in areas of producing art, Black arts institutions formed in the 1965 and 1970s. 1965 through the 1970s. There were the Studio Watts Workshop, Watts Symphony Orchestra Association, the Watts Writers Workshop, which produced the Watts Prophets, the Watts Summer Festival, the Watts Towers Arts Center, and the Mafundi Institute. And this marked the second Watts Renaissance to take place since the 1920s. This vernacular cottage in Watts is an excellent example of an early 20th century hipped roof with neoclassical influences and is eligible for designation. It represents the earliest patterns of development in the area. and it's a rare remaining example of an intact turn-of-the-century residence in Southeast Los Angeles. The Holy Redeemer is an outstanding example of the Mission Revival style with characteristics like the shaped parapet, the tower element, and the arched entryway. It's one of the very few architecturally significant buildings in Watts. The new temple, Missionary Baptist Church, hasn't been identified by Survey LA yet, but I think it's eligible for local. I think it could be eligible for local and California Register for its association with Miss Aretha Franklin at the beginning and the height of her career. Survey LA has deemed the What's Happening Cultural Center eligible for local, state, and national register. The Cultural Center was built to house the Mafundi Institute, which was founded in 1967. The Mafundi Institute was first housed in the What's Happening coffee house, which was a burned out furniture store converted to a neighborhood performing arts center by local youth that was located directly across from the current Cultural Center. The Mafundi Institute moved into their new building in 1970. And by that time, it was a well-known and established cultural arts institution. This was the same year that the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, was approved by President Richard Nixon as a result of the Earth Day movement. Legislation on clean air, clean water, toxic substances, and endangered species were also passed that year, along with 20 million Americans celebrating the first Earth Day. The Mafundi building was designed by Robert Alexander Kennard and Arthur Harry Silvers during their partnership. Both were USC graduates and active leaders in the civil rights movement, and they also helped to draft civil rights legislation. They encouraged young people, especially women and minorities, to pursue careers in architecture and design. The Mafundi building was one of the most prominent cultural centers in Los Angeles from 1970 to 1975, and the only cultural arts center of its kind in any Black neighborhood anywhere in the US at the time. Hollywood elites stopped by and taught classes there, but it was also a significant community center for local artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, and poets who would go on to be influential and famous, like Roger E. Mosley, Marla Gibbs, and Marie Bryant. The Cultural Heritage Commission just recently voted to take the nomination for historic cultural monument status under consideration for the Cultural Center. There's a second hearing and a vote by the Plum Committee and a full city council before it becomes an official historic cultural monument. Between 1956 and 1994, Kennard and Silvers jointly worked on projects in Watts that included the Bank of America on Central Avenue near 103rd Street. It was the first bank built in Watts since 1917. They designed other buildings in the community, but I think this is one of the ones that can meet the criteria for designation as a local landmark. Another potential resource to be landmarked is one of the community's natural resources on the corner of Century Boulevard and Compton Avenue. It's an excellent example of a mature Morton Bay Fig located in a dense urban area that's generally lacking in street trees. It's locally eligible only because natural features don't qualify for national or California register. And of course, there's the Watts Towers. It has multiple designations. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's designated a National Historic Landmark. It's listed on the California Register of Historical Resources, and it's also a Los Angeles Historic Cultural Monument. The resource was designated because it embodies the distinguishing characteristics of an architectural type specimen, inherently valuable for a study of a period style or method of construction. It's a piece of sculpture that reflects a unique engineering method through the use of wire mesh in both tension and compression. Then there's the Watts Towers Arts Center. I think that it has the potential to be eligible for local and state designation because it's internationally known for its association with and development of master artists, including Noah Purefoy and John Outerbridge, who were assemblage artists. Lastly, there's the Watts Labor Action Community Center, or WLCAC. I believe it has the potential to qualify for local designation for its long history and influence on community health and environmental issues. So these are just a few of the resources that have been protected by poverty and disinvestment, as is the case in communities of color. Our historic resources are protected because nobody looks at us. Earth Day is much more than a time to remember saving the planet's natural resources. It's also about remembering to save its architectural and cultural resources. I have hopes that we'll not only have fresh food and water and a contaminant-free environment, but that our tangible and intangible heritage will be safeguarded here in Watts. So thank you. Stop sharing.